It was a Tuesday afternoon, September 18th, 2023, the kind of day where the city hums steadily, unbothered by its own chaos. In a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, Victor Cole, a billionaire investor with empires in technology, real estate, and more, was seated at the head of a sprawling boardroom table. His polished suit spoke of power. His assistant's nervous glances hinted at precision. Nothing in this room was ever out of place. Until his phone rang. It was an unknown number, the kind most people would ignore. But something in the back of his mind, a faint, unrelenting instinct, made Victor swipe to answer. What he heard next froze him. "Mr. Cole?" The voice on the other end was small and unsteady. Your son is lying on the sidewalk. He's bleeding." And no one else stopped. For a moment, Victor's world stilled. The bustling boardroom around him faded to static. His chest tightened as the words sunk in. His son, Jordan, his only child. The next sound was the scrape of his chair against the floor as he stood abruptly. The glass-paneled walls around him shuddered as he stormed past his stunned colleagues. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think, but he knew one thing. He had to get to Jordan. 9 minutes later, a helicopter skimmed across the Manhattan skyline. The city below blended into a blur of steel and glass. Victor sat rigid in his seat, fists clenched. He thought of the last thing Jordan had said to him that morning. "Bye, Dad." Just 2 words, spoken without looking up. The weight of every missed birthday, every canceled dinner now crushed him. When the helicopter landed near the Bronx, Victor ran. He hadn't run in years, not in a suit, not in dress shoes, but nothing could stop him now. And then he saw him. Jordan Cole, 16 years old, lay motionless on the cracked asphalt near a basketball court. Blood streaked his temple, pooling into his blonde hair. His face, pale and bruised, looked nothing like the boy Victor had dropped off at school just hours ago. But Jordan wasn't alone. Beside him stood a figure so small she could have been a shadow. A 6-year-old black girl in a red hoodie, her jeans soaked at the cuffs. In one hand, she clutched a cracked phone. Her other hand trembled against her side. Victor dropped to his knees beside Jordan. His voice cracked as he called his son's name, but Jordan didn't stir. A medic pulled Victor back gently. "Sir, he has a strong pulse, but we need to move now." Before the ambulance door shut, Victor glanced back at the little girl. She stood frozen, watching. Her eyes, wide, raw, and unblinking, were locked on Jordan. And in that moment, Victor realized something. This child, who had no reason to stay, had done more for his son than anyone else.
Her name was Nia Brooks. She wasn't supposed to be there. She should have been anywhere else, a classroom, a playground, or even just a warm place with socks on her feet. But instead, she stood there, shivering in the cold autumn wind, refusing to leave a boy she didn't know. Victor approached her after the medics loaded Jordan into the ambulance. He knelt to her level, his voice still raw with panic. Are you the one who called me?" Nia nodded, clasping her small hands together. "Yes, sir." "You stayed with him?" Her response was simple. "I didn't want him to be alone." Victor swallowed hard. For a moment, he forgot about the boardroom, the helicopter, the empire he'd built. He forgot about the numbers, the deadlines, the carefully curated life he'd crafted. In front of him was a child with nothing, no socks, no coat, no safety net, who had shown more humanity in one moment than he had in years. Victor reached for his wallet, the reflex of a man who had solved problems with money his entire life. "Here," he said, pulling out a few bills. "Let me—" Nia stepped back sharply. "No, sir, I don't want money." Victor froze, stunned. "Then what do you want?" She glanced at the ambulance. its lights casting red and blue streaks across the street. I just hoped someone would care enough to come. Those words hit him harder than anything else that day. Because the truth was, he hadn't been there for Jordan. Not the way he should have been. But this girl had. She had stayed. Victor took off his scarf and gently wrapped it around Nia's small shoulders. She blinked up at him, confused. But that's yours. I'll be okay, he said softly. You stayed with my son. That makes you braver than most people I know. Nia didn't respond, but her eyes softened. For a fleeting moment, Victor saw something in her gaze, something unbreakable. Later that night, as Victor sat beside Jordan's hospital bed, he couldn't stop thinking about her, the girl in the red hoodie. She had no reason to stop, no obligation to care. Yet she had stayed. And in that quiet, sterile hospital room, Victor Cole, a man who had spent his life solving problems with power and wealth, realized something that shook him to his core. Sometimes, it isn't the people with the most who make the biggest difference. It's the ones with the least.
Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Victor's search for answers leads him back to Nia, and a bond begins that will change both their lives forever. If this story moved you, don't forget to follow for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Nia's shoes? In the cold, sterile quiet of the hospital room, the only sounds were the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Victor Cole sat motionless beside his son's bed, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled. Jordan's pale face was turned slightly to the side, his hair matted with dried blood. One eye was swollen shut, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Victor had spent his career building systems that predicted markets, launching empires that reshaped industries. But sitting here, he had never felt more powerless. "Doctor says you're going to be okay," Victor whispered, his voice unsteady, as though saying it out loud might make it true. "You just need to rest. You're stronger than me, kid." Jordan didn't stir. Victor leaned back, his eyes drifting to the ceiling, the flicker of fluorescent lights casting faint shadows across the walls. No amount of logic, money, or power could undo what had happened. A quiet knock broke the silence. A middle-aged nurse, clipboard in hand, stepped inside. "Mr. Cole," she said gently. "He's stable for now. No internal bleeding. Just a mild concussion and some bruising. But his body needs time to recover." Victor nodded, forcing himself to exhale. "When will he wake up?" "Maybe a few hours, maybe longer," she replied. "Let him rest." Then, hesitating, she added, "There's something else. The little girl who called you, Nia, she's still in the lobby. She's been waiting all night." Victor blinked. He had forgotten, lost in his own panic. "She's still here?" The nurse nodded. "Drinking cocoa. Refused to leave until she knew your son was okay." Victor rose slowly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. He stepped out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hospital hall. In the dimly lit lobby, Nia sat curled in a plastic chair, her small frame swallowed by the oversized red hoodie. A paper cup of cocoa sat in her lap, half empty. She looked up as he approached, her wide eyes faintly bloodshot but unwavering. Victor crouched to her level, scanning her face for answers. "Why didn't you go home?" She shrugged, her voice small but steady. "He looked scared. I know what that feels like." Victor's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to process the fact that this child, who had nothing, had given everything in the moment it mattered most. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice raw. "You didn't have to stay, but you did." Nia glanced down at her cocoa, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger. "I just didn't want him to feel alone." Victor sat beside her, rubbing a hand over his face.
He'd spent nearly 2 decades shielding Jordan from every possible harm: private schools, gated communities, endless security measures. And yet, it was this girl with chapped hands and no coat who had done what no one else would. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. Naya hesitated. "Grandma's home, but she's sick. I can't stay long. She gets worried if I'm out too late." Victor frowned. "Do you have a way to get home?" She shook her head. "I usually just walk." Something inside him snapped. The thought of this child walking alone at night through the Bronx hit him like a fist. "No," he said firmly. "I'll take you. Come on." Naya hesitated, then stood slowly.
If stories like this move you and you're still watching without subscribing, ask yourself, why hesitate to support channels that remind us kindness still exists? Hit subscribe now or drop a comment telling us why you won't, because stories like Naya's deserve to be seen, and together we can shine a light on the humanity that so often goes unnoticed. 2 days later, Victor found himself sitting across from Ms. Carter, a caseworker from Child Protective Services. The hospital had flagged Naya's situation, and the system was quick to respond. Ms. Carter, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard that seemed heavier than it should, didn't waste time. "Mr. Cole," she began, "we need to discuss Naya Brooks's circumstances. She's a minor, living with an elderly guardian in poor health. There's no legal custody agreement on file. Frankly, she's at risk of falling through the cracks." Victor leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "She saved my son's life. And now you're telling me the system might take her away from the only family she has left?" Ms. Carter didn't flinch. "The system doesn't operate on sentiment, Mr. Cole. We operate on facts. And the fact is, Naya's situation is unstable. Without intervention, she could end up in foster care." Victor's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He had seen enough contracts and legal battles to recognize the cold efficiency of bureaucracy. But this wasn't a merger or an acquisition. This was a child's life. "She's not just a case number," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's a person who deserves more than this." Ms. Carter sighed, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "The system has rules, Mr. Cole, and those rules don't bend easily." For the first time in years, Victor felt powerless again, not because of the system itself, but because he could see how easily it swallowed people like Naya. That evening, he drove back to 3B. The hallway smelled faintly of burnt food and mildew. Naya's grandmother, a frail woman with labored breathing, opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw Victor standing there. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice trembling, "is Naya okay?" "She's fine," Victor assured her. "But I need to talk to you about what happens next. The system is watching, and we can't let them take her." The grandmother sank into a worn chair, her hands shaking. "They tried before, said I wasn't enough for her. But she's all I have." Victor knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Then let me help. Not take her away. Just help." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Victor said, his throat tightening, "she's already done more for my family than I can ever repay." You're deep into this story now. Imagine a child like Nia slipping through the cracks while people scroll past. Don't just watch, stand with us. Subscribe or comment why you think so many choose silence, because silence is what lets stories like Nia's get lost. In the next chapter, Victor faces his first true moral war against the system as he fights to protect Nia from disappearing into foster care. But the question remains, will the rules of the system break her spirit, or will Victor's resolve be enough to change everything? The air on Nia's old block always felt heavier, as if weighed down by layers of stories no one wanted to tell. The cracked sidewalks, the faint smell of burnt oil, the graffiti that stretched across brick walls, each detail whispered a truth Nia had spent months trying to leave behind. But the past, as she was learning, never stayed silent for long. It began with a letter.
One afternoon, as Nia sorted through the mail at the Bennett estate, she noticed an envelope with her name scrawled across it in jagged black ink. No return address, no stamp, just her name. She opened it slowly, her heart already racing. Inside was a single note, written on ripped notebook paper. You don't belong with them. You forgot who you are. Come back before someone reminds you. Her hands shook as she read it again. She knew exactly who had sent it. Derek Moss. He was a name she hadn't spoken in months, a figure she had hoped to never see again. Back on her old block, Derek had been a constant presence. A man in his late 20s who lingered too long in the shadows, who always seemed to know when someone was vulnerable. He had helped her once, carrying groceries for her grandmother when Nia's hands were too small to manage the weight. But his kindness had come with strings. He used her to run errands, pick up packages she didn't ask about, deliver envelopes she wasn't allowed to open. And when she stopped, when she told him no one too many times, his smile turned sharp. That last time, she remembered the way he looked at her, not with anger, but with possession. Now, months later, here he was again, trying to pull her back into a life she had fought so hard to escape. Nia didn't tell Victor about the note immediately. Instead, she folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her hoodie. But the weight of it stayed with her, dragging down her steps, her smile, her voice. That evening, as she sat on the back patio, staring at the skyline, Victor joined her. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers fidgeted with the fabric of her jeans. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. Nia hesitated, then pulled the note from her pocket and handed it to him. Victor read it once, his jaw tightening. Then he read it again, slower this time, as if trying to memorize every word. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Derek," she whispered. He used to make me do things I didn't want to do." Victor's expression darkened. "Does he still live near your old building?" She nodded, avoiding his gaze. "He's not going to stop. He thinks he owns me, like I owe him something." Victor leaned forward, his voice steady. "Nia, listen to me. No one owns you, and you don't owe him or anyone anything." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But what if he doesn't stop?" Victor exhaled, his mind already racing. "Then we make sure he can't hurt you. Not now. Not ever." That night, Victor called Marcus Kane, the ex-military security consultant who had helped him before. Marcus didn't ask many questions. He simply listened, took notes, and promised to handle it. By sunrise, Derek Moss was no longer just a ghost from Nia's past. He was a problem with a target on his back.
3 days later, the Bennett family stood in the polished marble lobby of the Manhattan Family Court. The guardianship hearing for Nia Brooks had been moved up, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Victor adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable as they waited to be called. Beside him, Nia fidgeted with the silver bracelet Loretta had given her for good luck. It was a small, delicate thing, but she clung to it like a lifeline. When their case was called, they stepped into the courtroom. Judge Lillian Graves presided, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her reputation was one of fairness, but also of precision. She didn't tolerate theatrics. The CPS representative, Miss Carter, began her argument. "Your Honor," she said, her tone professional but pointed, "while we recognize Mr. Cole's financial stability and his willingness to provide for Nia, we must also consider his motives. He is a public figure under constant media scrutiny. This case has already received significant attention, raising concerns that his actions may be more about optics than genuine care." Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Carter continued, "Additionally, Nia Brooks has a complex background. Her transition into such a high-profile household could create challenges that neither party is equipped to handle. Foster care, while not perfect, offers a structured approach tailored to the child's needs." The courtroom fell silent as she finished. Then it was Victor's turn. He stood slowly, his presence commanding but not imposing. "Your Honor,"
he began, his voice steady. "I understand the concerns raised here today, but let me be clear. I'm not offering promises. I'm offering a life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Naya doesn't need another system. She needs stability. She needs to know that someone sees her, not as a case file, not as a statistic, but as a person who matters. Victor turned to look at Naya, his expression softening. She's already been through more than any child should, and yet she's still here, still standing. That kind of strength deserves to be met with action, not bureaucracy. The courtroom was still. Even Miss Carter seemed momentarily disarmed. Judge Graves leaned forward, her hands folded. "Mr. Cole, you've made a compelling case, but this court needs to be sure that what you're offering is more than words. Can you provide the structure, the consistency, and the care that Naya needs, long-term?" Victor met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor, and I'll prove it every single day." Graves sat back, her expression thoughtful. "Very well, I'll take this under advisement. A decision will be issued within 48 hours. As they left the courtroom, the tension in the air was palpable. Outside, reporters clustered near the steps, cameras flashing, questions flying. Victor placed a protective hand on Naya's shoulder, guiding her past the chaos. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of the living room, Naya spoke softly. "Do you think the judge will let me stay?" Victor looked at her, his voice firm but kind. "I don't know what she'll decide, but no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. We're in it together." Naya nodded, her fingers brushing against the silver bracelet. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope.
Think about it. How many kids like Naya never get this chance? How many stories like hers end without a voice to fight for them? If you're watching without subscribing, are you really supporting the stories that need to be told? Prove it. Hit subscribe or drop a comment explaining why you think so many choose silence, because together we can make sure these stories are never forgotten. In the next chapter, the courtroom's decision sets the stage for an even greater battle against the shadows of Naya's past and the cracks in a system designed to forget children like her. Will Victor's fight for Naya be enough to protect her from the forces closing in? On a brisk Tuesday morning, the story broke. Tessa Monroe, a scandal-chasing blogger with a knack for controversy, published an explosive piece on her website, Expose Daily. The headline was designed to provoke. "Wealthy mogul buys poor black child. The truth behind Victor Cole's guardianship of Naya Brooks." The story wasn't just a hit piece, it was a calculated attack. Tessa spun Naya's story into a narrative of manipulation, painting Victor as a billionaire using his wealth to collect a child for good PR. She questioned his motives, hinted at ulterior agendas, and left readers with one damning question. Was this guardianship about Naya or about Victor's image? The article spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like "Billionaire Baby Snatcher" and "Naya deserves better." Comment sections filled with outrage, conspiracy theories, and armchair analysts dissecting Victor's life from every angle. But the most damaging blow wasn't online. It was the whispers that followed Naya into the hallways of her school. At first, she didn't notice. The other students had always been curious about her, watching her from a distance, asking questions that felt more like probing. But after Monroe's article, the curiosity turned into something sharper. "She's not really family," someone whispered behind her in the lunch line. "She just got lucky," another voice added. Naya tried to ignore them, staring down at her tray of spaghetti and applesauce. But the words clung to her louder than the cafeteria noise. By the time she reached her usual table, her appetite was gone. She sat alone, pushing food around her plate until Ethan arrived. He plopped his tray down across from her with his usual grin. "Science class was brutal today," he said, but when Naya didn't respond, his smile faded. "What's wrong?" Naya shook her head without looking up. "It's nothing." Ethan frowned.
It doesn't look like nothing. She glanced around the room, catching the sidelong glances and muffled whispers. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. Maybe I don't belong here.
Later that evening, Victor found Naya sitting on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled to her chest. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the bedside lamp. He sat down beside her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." Victor's chest tightened. He had seen the headlines, read the comments, felt the sting of public judgment, but hearing those doubts come from Naya cut deeper than anything else. "Naya," he said softly, "you're not here because of luck. You're here because you're family." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if I'm just temporary?" Victor reached for her hand, his voice steady. "You're not temporary. You're not a headline. You're family. And nothing will change that." For a moment, she stared at him, searching his face for cracks in his resolve. But there were none. Slowly she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Victor stayed with her until she fell asleep, the weight of her doubts slowly melting into the quiet of the night.
If you've ever felt like you didn't belong and this story touches you, pause for a second. Subscribe now or tell us in the comments how you found your place in the world, because stories like Naya's remind us that belonging isn't about where you start, it's about where you're seen. As Victor worked to shield Naya from the storm outside, another threat crouched closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. Derek Moss hadn't disappeared. He had been watching, circling the edges of Naya's new life like a wolf stalking its prey. His resentment had grown sharper with every news story, every image of her smiling behind Victor. In his mind, she didn't deserve this new life. She belonged to the streets she came from, and to him. One evening, as Naya walked to the car after school, she saw him. He was standing across the street, leaning against a light pole with a cigarette dangling between his fingers. His hood was pulled low, but she knew it was him. His grin was unmistakable, a cruel, knowing curve of his lips. Her steps faltered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Naya!" Ethan called from behind her, snapping her out of her trance. She turned quickly, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the car. "What's wrong?" he asked, confused. "Nothing," she lied, her voice shaky. "Let's just go." Victor noticed the tension the moment they got home. Naya was quiet, her usual energy replaced with something heavier. "What happened?" he asked gently. She hesitated, staring down at her hands. "I saw him," she said finally. "Derek, outside school." Victor's expression hardened, but he kept his voice calm. "Did he say anything to you?" "No," she whispered, "but he didn't have to." Victor stood, pulling out his phone. "This ends now." The next morning, Victor called in Malik Stone, an old friend and ex-military ally. Malik was a man of few words, but his presence alone was enough to make most people think twice. "I need someone I can trust," Victor said as they sat in his office. "Someone who can keep her safe without making her feel like she's in a prison." Malik nodded. "I'll handle it." Quietly, Malik and his team began shadowing Naya's movements. They blended into the background, a car parked down the street, an extra face in the school lobby, but they were always there, watching, waiting.
One evening, as Naya sat on the living room floor sketching in her notebook, Victor joined her. He sat cross-legged beside her, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled. She glanced up but didn't say anything. "I talked to Malik," Victor said gently. "He's going to make sure Derek doesn't come near you again." Naya's pencil stilled. "I didn't want to tell you," she admitted after a moment.
I didn't want you to send me away. Victor's heart ached at her words. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Naya, listen to me. Nothing you do will make me send you away. Nothing. Her lips trembled, and she looked down at her sketchbook. I don't want to lose this. Victor's voice softened. You won't. This is your home, Naya, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. She nodded, her grip on her pencil tightening. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost. Safety. In the weeks that followed, Malik's presence proved invaluable. Derek's attempts to linger near Naya's new world were met with quiet but firm warnings. A car parked too long outside the school was suddenly joined by an unmarked SUV. A shadow near the Bennett estate vanished after a single sharp glare from Malik. Derek tried to push back, but the message was clear. Naya was no longer his to manipulate. By the time spring arrived, the weight of Derek's shadow had begun to lift. Naya smiled more, laughed freely, and started to believe that her new life wasn't just a temporary reprieve. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the city lights blinked in the distance, she would think of her old block, the cracked sidewalks, the whispers of the past. And she would remind herself over and over again, I'm not going back. In the next chapter, a final showdown in the courtroom will determine Naya's future. As Victor faces CPS's final arguments, the question looms. Can love and resolve triumph over a system built to forget children like Naya? Mrs. Hendricks stood at the front of the classroom, her weathered hands clasping a stack of papers. The assignment she had given 3 weeks ago hung in the air like a challenge none of them had expected. Write something true, she had said. Not an essay about summer vacation, not a report on the Revolutionary War, something true. Most of the students had written about pets, family trips, or the time they broke their arm falling off a bike. Safe truths, small truths, the kind that wouldn't crack open anything important. But Naya Brooks sat in the third row, staring at the blank page in front of her, knowing she had written something different. Mrs. Hendricks cleared her throat. Today, we'll hear a few pieces read aloud. Remember, these are anonymous. No names, no judgment. Just truth. She reached into a box on her desk and pulled out the first paper. This one is called The Hallway. Naya's breath caught. She recognized her own handwriting, her own words folded in Miss Hendricks' hands. The teacher began to read, her voice steady but soft. They say invisible people don't exist, but I know better. I was one for a long time, moving through hallways like smoke, sitting in corners like dust. People looked past me, through me, around me, like I wasn't worth the effort of seeing.
But the funny thing about being invisible is that you see everything. You see the boy who sits alone at lunch because his clothes smell like cigarettes. You see the girl who flinches when someone raises their voice too loud. You see the teacher who stays after school just so one kid won't have to go home to empty rooms. You see the moment when everything changes. I was walking home when I heard the sirens. Most people run toward safety when trouble comes, but some people run toward the sound. Not because they're heroes, not because they think they can fix everything, but because they know what it feels like to lie bleeding on cold concrete with no one coming. So I stayed. I stayed when everyone else ran. I stayed when my hands shook and my voice cracked making that phone call. I stayed because I remembered what it felt like to be invisible. And maybe, just maybe, staying made me visible for the first time. They say you can't choose your family, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes family chooses you. Sometimes the people who see you, really see you, become the ones who matter most. I'm not invisible anymore, but I remember what it felt like, and I'll never stop seeing the ones who still are. The classroom fell silent, not the restless silence of bored teenagers checking their phones, but the deep, breathless quiet that happens when someone speaks truth so raw it stops time. Mrs. Hendricks folded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the room. That, she said quietly, is what courage looks like on paper. Then something unexpected happened. One student started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium, because somehow word had spread and other classes had quietly filed in to listen, erupted in applause. Nia sat frozen, her cheeks burning. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to understand. After class, as students filed out, a girl named Carmen approached her desk. Carmen was one of those kids who existed in the middle, not popular, not unpopular, just there. "That was you, wasn't it?" Carmen whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Nia's heart hammered. She wanted to deny it, to disappear back into the safety of invisibility, but something in Carmen's eyes stopped her. "Yeah," she said quietly. Carmen smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I liked it. It made me feel less alone." She walked away before Nia could respond, but the words stayed. "It made me feel less alone." That afternoon, Nia found Victor in his study, surrounded by the usual chaos of contracts and phone calls. But when she knocked on the door, he set everything aside. "How was school?" he asked, the question he asked every day. This time she had a real answer. "I read something today, a poem I wrote." She settled into the chair across from his desk. Victor leaned forward, his full attention on her. What was it about? Nia hesitated, then pulled the folded paper from her backpack. She had asked Mrs. Hendricks for it back after class. It was about being invisible and about choosing to stay. She handed him the paper, watching his face as he read. His expression shifted, surprise, recognition, something deeper she couldn't name. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes bright. "Nia," he said softly, "this is beautiful and brave." She ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise. "It's just true. The truest things usually are the hardest to say." He folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. "I'm proud of you, not just for writing this, but for sharing it."
If Nia's words made you feel something, don't just close this video. Subscribe now, or drop a comment about what her poem reminded you of. Stories like this deserve to live on, and your voice matters too. The knock came on a Thursday evening, soft and uncertain against the heavy oak door of the Bennett estate. Victor was in the kitchen helping Nia with her algebra homework when Loretta appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "there is someone here to see Nia." Nia looked up from her textbook, a frown creasing her forehead. "Who?" Loretta's voice was gentle. "Your grandmother." The pencil slipped from Nia's fingers, rolling across the marble countertop. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It had been months since she'd seen Ruth Brooks. Months since that final conversation in the cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and the smell of old medicine. Victor reached out, his hand covering hers. "Do you want to see her?" Nia nodded, though her throat felt tight. They found Ruth Brooks standing in the foyer, small and fragile in a coat too big for her shrinking frame. Her hair was grayer than Nia remembered, her face more lined, but her eyes were the same, warm and tired and full of love she'd never quite known how to express. "Grandma," Nia whispered, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, running into arms that always smelled like peppermint and worry. Ruth held her granddaughter carefully, as if she might break. When they finally pulled apart, tears streaked both their faces. "Look at you," Ruth said, her voice shaking. "You're so tall, so healthy." She glanced around the gleaming foyer, taking in the crystal chandelier, the polished floors, the life her granddaughter now lived. There was no bitterness in her expression, only a quiet kind of gratitude. Victor stepped forward. "Mrs. Brooks, thank you for coming." Ruth nodded, studying his face. "I wanted to see her, to make sure—" She paused, searching for words. "To make sure she was really okay." "She's more than okay," Victor said simply. "She's family." They sat in the living room, the three of them creating an odd constellation on the plush furniture. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she sipped the tea Loretta had brought, but her voice was steady. "I can't give you what he can," she said to Nia, nodding toward Victor. "I never could. My health, the apartment, the money." She shook her head. "But I want you to know that letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done, and the rightest." Nia leaned forward, reaching for her grandmother's weathered hand. "I know, Grandma. I've always known." Ruth's eyes filled with fresh tears.
You were my sunshine, baby girl. My light in all that darkness. And I wanted to keep you close, but... She glanced around the room again. But sometimes, love means letting go so someone else can catch you. Victor cleared his throat softly. Mrs. Brooks, Naya will always be your granddaughter. Nothing changes that. You're welcome here whenever you want to see her. Ruth nodded, a small smile touching her lips. That's kind of you, Mr. Cole. But I know she's where she belongs now. They talked for another hour, about school, about Naya's poetry, about small things that felt enormous. When Ruth finally stood to leave, she pressed something into Naya's palm, a small silver locket, tarnished with age. This was your mother's, she said quietly. I always meant to give it to you. Naya opened the locket carefully. Inside was a tiny photograph, her mother as a young woman smiling at the camera with eyes exactly like Naya's. She loved you, you know, Ruth whispered. More than anything. She just couldn't figure out how to show it. 3 days later, they stood in Judge Graves' courtroom for the final hearing. The decision had already been made. Victor's guardianship would be extended permanently. But there were formalities to observe, papers to sign, futures to make official. Judge Graves looked down at Naya from her bench, her expression kind but serious. Miss Brooks, do you understand what this means? Yes, ma'am, Naya replied, her voice clear and strong. And this is what you want? Naya glanced at Victor, then at her grandmother, who sat in the back row with tears in her eyes. Yes, Your Honor, it is.
Judge Graves nodded. Then it's settled. Mr. Cole, Miss Brooks, congratulations. May this family you've chosen serve you both well. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their cameras and questions, but Victor guided Nia past them without stopping. In the car, as they drove through the bustling streets of Manhattan, he spoke quietly. You didn't run from something, Nia. You ran toward something. And that makes all the difference. She looked out the window at the city, flowing past, the same city where she'd once walked alone, invisible and afraid. Now it looked different, not because it had changed, but because she had. That evening, as the Bennett household settled into its rhythm of homework and dinner and quiet conversations, a figure stood across the street from the estate. Derek Moss had been watching for weeks, his resentment growing with each glimpse of Nia's new life. He flicked his cigarette into the gutter and muttered to the empty street, "She thinks she's untouchable now." But as he turned to walk away, he found his path blocked by Malik Stone. The security consultant didn't say a word, didn't make a threat. He simply stood there, solid and immovable, his message crystal clear. Derek's sneer faltered. He backed away slowly, disappearing into the shadows between streetlights. Inside the house, Nia sat at her desk, writing in the journal Victor had given her. Her words flowed onto the page, no longer about invisibility or fear, but about something else entirely. Today I learned that families aren't just born, they're built. Brick by brick, choice by choice, moment by moment. And sometimes the strongest foundations are laid not by blood, but by hands that refuse to let go. She closed the journal and looked out her window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there were other invisible children, other stories waiting to be told. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. Home.
If this ending left you thinking, don't just leave. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story, because the next one might be the one that changes someone's life. And that someone might be closer than you think.